Well, in the meantime, I will get started with our first reading. It's a reading by Jan Richardson. Hers is a voice that we often bring into this space. I particularly like this. It is called Blessing for the Brokenhearted. It comes from a whole book of hers that is filled with blessings for people who are in grief. It is a very beautiful book called Cure for Sorrow. This is Blessing for the Brokenhearted. Let us agree for now that we will not say the breaking makes us stronger, or that it is better to have this pain than to have done without this love. Let us promise we will not tell ourselves time will heal the wound when every day our waking opens it anew. Perhaps for now, it can be enough to simply marvel at the mystery of how a heart so broken can go on beating, as if it were made for precisely this, as if it knows the only cure for love is more of it, as if it sees the heart's sole remedy for breaking is to love still, as if it trusts that its own persistent pulse is the rhythm of a blessing we cannot begin to fathom, but will save us nonetheless. For our scripture reading this morning, we are going to hear just a very short couple verses from two Psalms. The first is Psalm 130, and the second is Psalm 126. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. Now, if supplications isn't a word you use a lot or just kind of rode right by you, I will share with you the translation that comes from what's called the Message and the translation of this verse, which carries the same urgency. A translation of that verse is this: Help, God, I have hit rock bottom. Please hear my cry for help. Listen hard. Open your ears, listen to my cries for mercy. And then from Psalm 126. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we rejoiced. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the watercourses in the Negeb. May those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. Those who go out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, carrying their sheaves. It was about 9 o'clock on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, 12 hours after that first plane hit that first tower. Hal Tausig, a former pastor here, and I had been in a staff meeting together when we heard the news. We immediately called the rabbi at Mishkan Shalom, a Jewish community who for about 5 years made this building their holy home and worshiped here each week in the sanctuary. We all agreed that we needed to come together that evening. And we did, lots of us. Some of you here today maybe were in this room then. We sang and prayed in English and in Hebrew, songs and prayers that our congregation knew, songs and prayers that their congregation knew. At that point, no one knew anything about what had happened or why. We just knew we needed to be together to mourn and grieve, to hold and be held. The service ended. This room was still packed with people who didn't seem to want to leave, finding solace in collective grief and reluctant to face whatever lay beyond that night. One of our church members came up to me after the service, and like so many, she was weeping deeply. She asked if we could talk. In that crowded room, there was nowhere for us to go, so the pews were still filled with people, so we moved to the quietest corner of the room I could find over there by the piano. She was crying so hard that it took a while for her to catch enough breath, and as I waited, I found myself trying to remember if she had family connections in New York City, wondering if someone she was close to worked in the towers or might have been missing. I was trying to anticipate what might come next. Then she got enough air to tell me that she had had a miscarriage several years before. As soon as she said it, a horrified look came over her face, and she started profusely apologizing for even thinking about something like that in the midst of all that so many people and our whole country had just lost. "Why am I feeling this now?" she cried, sobbing. "Why am I telling you this when I should be focusing on what's happening in our world, this terrifying thing that's happening right now? It feels so selfish. I don't know where this came from, but I can't shake it, and I am just so uncontrollably sad." Her own unfathomable and probably unprocessed loss of a child surfaced in the middle of a national trauma. I know I have told this story before, but as I look over the last 21 years, this is one of the moments that rises up for me when I think about some of the things that I have learned in this church. Because despite my own experiences of grief and loss in my personal life, as a pastor, as a hospital chaplain, and as a hospice chaplain, it wasn't until that conversation with that woman in that moment in this place that she taught me this. Grief is always looking for a way out, and it will take any chance it can get. It's like the crude oil which lies beneath the surface of the earth and is under intense pressure. If you drill down over here and create an escape valve, the pressure is released and the oil comes flying out. But if you drill down over here, the pressure is also released, and the same oil that lies underneath the surface, the same stuff will come out over here. Same stuff, different site. The depths that the psalmist, like so many of us, know so well. Out of the depths, we cry out. Grief and loss, sometimes a lifetime of accumulated grief and loss, especially when it's kept underground and hasn't had a chance to be expressed or processed or brought out into the light of day, can erupt unexpectedly when something bores down deep enough to tap all that lies beneath the surface, or just touches a nerve, or creates the tiniest crack in the surface. The horrors of September 11th can tap into the loss of a child. Watching a sad movie can trigger a feeling of brokenness that's simmering just beneath. These experiences nick the surface, and occasionally something dwelling more deeply within us breaks through. And I'm convinced we don't even need to know what it is that's being tapped. What grief wants from us is not to be understood or analyzed, but to be felt, to be released, and to be trusted. It's not surprising to me that our grief waits to squeeze out until we're in a dark movie theater, or surprises us when we're reading the paper or listening to the radio in our car, or noticing a wounded animal in the park. One of the few places that we're allowed to grieve is at funerals, and for the past 2 years, we've been essentially denied those ritual spaces. In our society, grief is not encouraged and is only allowed in very discreet and limited ways. As many of us have experienced, we're given a very short time to grieve before people expect us to be over it. And the grief of others can make us uncomfortable and ill at ease. Our culture denies grief and loss, and most tragically of all, it denies death. We all of us, come from lineages and people that dealt with death in their own ways. Some of our ancestral cultures and our ancestors were people that wailed. Some danced, some sang, some drank. Some came together as communities to lament, and some held things in private. One of the reasons that I love the Psalms is that they give us language for things that we are taught sometimes to avoid. The Psalms plumb the depth of human experience, and they articulate it all. Here we have models for what it might sound like to cry out to God in agony or pain or loneliness or ecstasy. The Psalms are full of the language of grief and a good place to turn when our own words fail us. Out of the depths I cry to you. Oh God, the bottom has fallen out of my life. If you're looking for something to read in the Bible, I suggest the Psalms. For some of us, there's a lifetime of stuff that's been built up and compressed, like the remains of small plants and animals from ancient seas, covered in sediment and ancient life, rich organic matter from all kinds of living stuff, condensed as the temperature and pressure increase. It's like we're walking around with whole worlds of stuff beneath the surface, rumbling or quiet, ready to blow or settled comfortably. Some of us might not feel it or notice it. Some of us experience it as irritation or anger, self-critique, fear or shame or guilt or blame or depression. It can feel like longing. Sometimes it fuels us. Some of us can sense it and have found ways to befriend it. Sometimes it can be dangerously volatile and can drive us to manage it in ways that aren't life-giving. And we carry grief in our bodies. When my grief bubbles up in uncomfortable ways and I'm not quite able to be at ease with it, for me, I try to eat and tend to push things down with food. That's what I do. Where does your grief live in you? Where in your body can you feel it or touch it? The Mayan translation for the word tumor, I learned this week, is hardened tears. That hit me right here when I learned that. I actually have a hard time crying. I can get deeply moved. I can cry with other people. I can cry for them. But I struggle to cry and express my own grief in tears. So I'm trying to learn to find other ways to be with my grief. Singing, for one, sometimes moving my body, a little yoga or a grief dance if I can do it, or just rocking or swaying. Sometimes lighting a candle. I have a little bowl of water on my desk that I dip my hands into as a substitute for my tears. I hope that you can find ways to honor your own grief and befriend it. I know and I'm sure Kip and Priscilla would be very happy to talk with you or have a conversation about it. And that's the personal stuff. We have such deep communal grief now. Planetary grief, some call it. Species-level grief is what Adrienne Murray Brown calls it. It's a grief that's bigger than us, bigger than but weaving itself into our own losses. Massive, and so many unnecessary deaths from COVID. 400 years of damage done by white supremacy, the accelerating loss of species and culture and climate change. We need more ways to grieve together. The Salt Trails Collective is an amazing project here in Philadelphia that our own Nyla Francis has helped to lead, and others in our community, including Priscilla, are involved in. This is a group of people that are creating public grief rituals in Philadelphia, places where people can come together and grieve together. No one explains their loss. Nobody has to explain what's happened or why they're grieving. They don't need to give reasons. Last week, they gathered in the Wissahickon to build an altar to love and collectively honor and express grief. It is really powerful stuff. The great poet Audre Lorde has said that we heal in community. And we do a version of this just by being church. One of the reasons that we do church, that we practice being church, is to create and hold a space, a ritual container that can allow the stuff of our lives to flow, to surface, to sometimes stay below, to sometimes come out in the light of day and the light of love, and know that it's held by something larger than ourselves, held by the Holy One, by God, by Jesus, by community, in love. We lament together. We name brokenness. We cry out. I've known so many people in this church, both our physical church and our Zoom church, that have found themselves more than once crying in church. I won't ask you to raise your hand if you're one of them. And it's why Art Knapp, one of our members, finally said enough, So many of us spend so much time crying in church and we never have tissues. And he walked in with a massive box of, remember this? Shrink-wrapped tissues. Huge amount of tissues. And he went and just sprinkled them liberally in the pews. And since that time, it's become our church administrator, Karen's, job to make sure that those are continually stocked. Maybe our Advent care packages should have included tissues. We need spaces where we can name things, name them to ourselves, to God, maybe those who are here who can witness us and hear us into speech. We witness and hear our children into speech, as we just heard. Kids that feel nervous going up there the first time or every time. Kids that go up and know that this is a place where they can say something important and people are listening. Eli said he would get nervous and still does a little. Emma said she would start walking up to the steps and be thinking, what is it that I want to share today? It's what we do. We name the ways that we're falling apart. We name the things that are happening in our lives. We name times we've screwed up or we've been hurt or we've hurt someone else. We name the times that we are sick or tired or, as Fannie Lou Hamer said, sick and tired. We name the ways that we're failing or dying or healing or in recovery or relapsing. And maybe we get to name places that we get a glimmer of hope or are just starting to live again. We can tell in this space together what the old spiritual says, how I got over. We can say or whisper or sing or shout a name that the world is so incredibly broken and so heartbreakingly beautiful. In the prayer time that we do each time we worship, we hear or see or just know that there are other people in the room who are experiencing these things too. Even if we will never know their stories, even if we don't know their names, but we might just find ourselves thinking about them on Tuesday for no reason that we can really make sense of. But that's really what prayer is. One of the best images I had of church this week happened yesterday when, after scrambling to make sure we had enough volunteers covering all the things today that needed to be covered, Kip heard back from Stephanie, who you don't see because she's right behind the camera. She said that she could help run the camera and indicated that Sandy, who's also here behind the camera, would be able to help as well. And as I understand it, Stephanie's exact message was, between the two of us, we'll have things in and out of focus. This is what we do at church. Know that together we will have things in and out of focus. That we can get and give permission to be fully who we are, and get and give permission to risk taking the smallest steps toward becoming who we might be next. To testify, to use the old church language, to witness, to celebrate the ways in which love has brought us this far and will not abandon us. Grief isn't just pain. It's a form of love. It's a release. It's a practice. It's medicine. It empties us. It makes room for something new. In the words of the psalm, those who sow in tears will reap in joy. The act of naming our loss and giving expression to grief is spiritual work. So if you're afraid of doing it or afraid it's a waste of time and you're somebody who needs to know that you've got a project, this is good spiritual work. It's work that we don't do alone. We are accompanied and carried by God. We're part of a community that affirms that death is natural and inevitable and sacred. We come from lineages and carry the wisdom and dreams and love of our ancestors. We learn from them and each other as we prepare ourselves to be ancestors one day. We witness to the power and possibility of healing, to resurrection and new life. And we've been handed over the story of Jesus, who knew suffering, struggle, fear, and death. Those who sow in tears will reap in joy. So let us weep. Let us put our hands in the dirt, shut the door, turn on the song, dance in grief, cry if you can, dip your hands in the water if you can't. Someday this week, maybe remember a prayer that someone raised Think of them, touch your hand to their heart. Let that be your prayer. I'll close with these words by a really incredible person here in Philadelphia, Reverend Retta Morgan, who is a prophet, a poet, a teacher, an artist, and she's one of the leaders of the Salt Trail Collective. Here she is expressing gratitude for what holds us in grief, cracks us open, delivers balm, touches the deepest ache, calls forth our tears, gives voice to what we cannot, welcomes an infinite range of expression, reminds us to enter the darkness with reverence, invites tenderness and compassion, compels us to move our bodies, take a deeper breath, brings life to what feels lifeless, spills light on the path, offers a moment of beauty, and sings us home to our truth. This is God's good news. Amen.